Russia just did something utterly bizarre in Venezuela. Sorry, but there is no other way to describe the situation. And if the claims are true, then Ukraine may get to twist an apparently bad situation into a good one. Let's roleplay for a second. Imagine that you work in the Kremlin, and right now, Ukraine is in the midst of such an expansive air campaign that I feel the need to play this timeline at 10x speed or so, lest I unnecessarily stall out the narrative of this video. But again, you work in the Kremlin. Do you, 1, send air defenses to Venezuela, or 2, do you not send air defenses to Venezuela? Well, if you said do not, then congratulations. You made a sensible strategic choice. After all, you need those air defenses to prevent the situation inside of Russia from getting even worse. But you apparently would not be matching the Kremlin's current strategy. I say apparently because there are some complications here, but that is where things stand now. There is a lot to unravel here, so let's start with what we know. On October 26th, a Russian Il-76 cargo plane landed in Venezuela. You might remember this as the one that had to take an elaborate flight path through Armenia, Algeria, Morocco, Senegal, and Mauritania, as we discussed earlier this week. At the time, we did not have much of an idea what was actually inside the plane. Small arms, Russian advisors, weapons for the naval domain. Well, now a Russian lawmaker claims that the plane delivered Panzer S-1 and Buk M2 air defense systems to Venezuela. This is not some random person either. He is on the Duma's Defense Committee, meaning that he is in a position to know what is happening. And before we get into the more serious implications for wars in both hemispheres, well, one that is actually happening now and another that may break out soon, let me point out that Russian legislators can say a lot of things, and they do not need to be true. This lawmaker in particular had lobbied to send nuclear weapons to Cuba and Venezuela after the invasion of Ukraine began. Something about punishing the United States for any aid it might provide to Ukraine. That might give you an idea of his overall worldview. Also, Il-76 planes are big, but they are not that big. And those systems cited are large themselves. So it is unclear how one single flight to Venezuela would have delivered multiple copies of multiple systems. The Il-76 bounced around some Latin American countries after its initial stop in Venezuela, and then stopped in Venezuela again. But unless Russia was rearranging systems from, say, Cuba, or operating stealth flights that no one in the open-source intel community could observe, then the quantity of the aid is dubious. You could make the case that the Kremlin wanted to make a token gesture, and that the lawmaker went into overdrive with his rhetoric. It is also weird that the lawmaker would publicize anything that happened. A private company was operating the flight. Now, the private carrier, in itself, is not weird. The Soviet Union made a ton of Il-76 planes, and cargo carriers are cargo carriers. Civilians can use them too. But when the map of oil and gas strikes looks like this, giving another country air defenses feels like the ultimate let-them-eat-cake moment. Thus, I would want to transfer some equipment covertly, not because of the traditional interstate secret reasons, but rather to hide what is happening from my own public. But let's put aside all of those question marks for at least most of the rest of this video, and take the lawmaker's claim at face value. Then what should we make of it? I think that there are 3 points worth exploring. We should focus first on the deeper implications of the cake problem. What does it say if Putin prefers to prioritize Venezuelan air defense over the next most vulnerable target in Russia? Well, let's explore 2 possibilities. The tempting explanation is that the Kremlin is simply misreading the situation. And I say the tempting explanation because it was a significant misreading of both Ukrainian domestic politics and Russia's own military capacity that led to this declaration of a special military operation on February 24th, 2022. And thus a meme has formed. The Kremlin is clueless and makes mistakes all the time. So clearly, this is just the next iteration of that. Okay, obviously there is some truth to the Kremlin having systemic faults, but I think that it is worth revisiting how that miscalculation arose and understanding why the situation today is different. The obvious trouble with trying to guess another country's resolve is that, as we have explored with some trusty lines many times, the opponent has all the incentive in the world to bluff resolve, regardless of its true disposition. Of course, Russia sent intelligence operatives into Ukraine to look for answers on the eve of the war. But it is hard to get a clear picture, and it is even harder for the folks back at headquarters to know whether their operatives are doing a good job. And heck, I am not sure that many Ukrainians would have bet that the country would unite as much as it did after it came under attack. As for the other half of Russia's uncertainty issues, there was a clear disconnect between what soldiers and officers on the ground understood and what was making its way back up to the Kremlin. There is plenty of blame to spread around for that. Russia's hollowed-out independent media, failure to follow through on corruption initiatives, the COVID-19 pandemic, certain Putin appointments, Putin's own unwillingness to travel to inspect the problems. The list goes on. And as I was editing this, I realized I said corruption initiatives instead of anti-corruption initiatives. A Freudian slip, perhaps, because it does capture the state of affairs in Moscow. But what is critical to understand here is that the Kremlin has made the proper adjustments to war policy when new information becomes publicly available. The battlefield losses, the failure to capture Kyiv, and the general political unity of Ukraine meant that Russia needed to adjust its strategy after the first couple of months of the invasion. And adjust Russia did. Put differently, the problem is less of Russia being naive with its strategizing, and more about failing to obtain good information about how its strategies will play out. That may sound like an academic distinction, but it is not. And it matters here because the refinery attacks are publicly observable. No one in the Kremlin is unsure about whether they are happening. And if you are unsure whether the information is filtering up there, remember that there are plenty of oligarchs who spend plenty of time in the Kremlin that are scared out of their minds about what is happening. Thus, information on that front is not a problem. The second explanation is that the Kremlin has the Russian public politically locked down. In other words, it does not matter whether the refineries are all getting blown up and gasoline prices are surging. The Russian population is no threat to the Kremlin, and the Kremlin only cares about foreign policy, so the Russian people can just deal with it. Basically, we are back to the cake, except the Kremlin is ostensibly sure that the story today will not end the way it did for Marie Antoinette. Oh, and for all of you walking your dogs right now, of which apparently there are many, I am now showing an image of her execution. Also, Thor was a very good boy. Let's all draw a line for him today. This would be an odd position for the Kremlin to take, though, because subsidized gasoline prices have long been a part of the Russian social contract. They get cheap gas prices, and they can ignore foreign policy. But that means that if they are not getting cheap gas prices, they should not be ignoring foreign policy. So it would be weird to suddenly pivot from that position. But if that is the Kremlin's thought process, connecting back to the first point, there is no guarantee that the Kremlin is right about its political dominance. Public willingness to protest is hard to gauge until an objectionable policy comes into place. So the real test may be seeing how the Russian population reacts. The fall 2022 mobilization provides a case study of this principle. It is also another example of the Kremlin updating its war strategy given what it observes on the battlefield. The Kremlin thought that it could win with what it had. It could not. So the Kremlin mobilized and thought it would be politically fine to do so. It was not. So the Kremlin adjusted before it became a political disaster. Thus, to conclude this part of the video, maybe what the lawmaker claimed actually is happening. Maybe it is a bit of an experiment, and maybe the policy is subject to change. Or maybe the Russian lawmaker is still full of bluster. But let's continue to a couple more key points, presupposing that the aid is a more serious policy decision from the Kremlin. I need to be precise with my next words. Observing an aid disbursement is informative of Russia's belief that Trump's deployment is not a pure bluff. Note that I am not saying that the Kremlin believes that a war will happen, just that Trump is serious about something. Now, it is tempting to look at the situation and say that things only make sense if Russia believes that the United States will attack. Otherwise, those air defenses need to be in Russia. However, this is where having a good knowledge of lines on maps tells you something subtle. In crisis bargaining, the deals made to avoid a war must be commensurate with the balance of power. So the more power Venezuela has, the better it will do either in terms of a negotiated settlement or an expected war outcome, whichever one is how this conflict ultimately concludes. Surprisingly, arms are just as useful in a coercive peace as they are in a war. As a result, Russia receives its return on investment one way or another. The transfer should not be interpreted as evidence that Russia expects a war to actually start. It is, however, informative of Russia's expectation that this is not a pure bluff from Trump. That is the distinction here between a coercive peace and waving a white flag. In other words, Trump is not doing this for show, only to pull back without receiving any concessions. Perhaps that should not come as a shock. We have discussed in abstract terms before how the deployment is inconsistent with a pure bluff. The New York Times, citing sources inside of the White House, also indicates as much. But it is always helpful to have some confirmation from a state-level entity. Finally, the transfer raises interesting questions about how Ukraine should feel regarding the whole situation. As of late, the key word you most frequently hear from policymakers in Kyiv is tomahawks. With that as a backdrop, holding everything else equal, you would be tempted to conclude that a US-Venezuela war would be bad for Ukraine. After all, tomahawks would be one of the naval deployment's primary strike options, and the more that they get used in Venezuela, the less freedom that there is to send them to Ukraine. And up until the claim of air defense deliveries to Venezuela, I would have been in agreement there. But now the picture is a bit foggier. If the Kremlin is as out of touch with the situation inside of the Federation as the Russian lawmakers' claim suggests, then the shadow of an active war in Venezuela might cause Russia to send even more equipment over to Venezuela. That would open the skies further for Ukrainian drone strikes, more public discontent inside of Russia, and who knows from there. In sum, I think that we should take what anyone in the Russian government says with a grain of salt. But goodness, is it a bizarre development. Speaking of bizarre things, I am just going to end this video now, straight up. Like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.